Here's how you can get better conditioning in 30 minutes a week. Now, we've all been told to improve our aerobic energy system to not gas out in a fight. So that means you went and hit the roads and slogged long miles. But this is only a small piece of the puzzle. And new research suggests that there are more effective and efficient methods for improving your conditioning for combat sports. See, intensity dictates the adaptive response, meaning the intensity we perform a certain exercise, whether that's in the gym or with our conditioning, is going to elicit a different adaptation depending on the intensity we use. The volume we perform is going to dictate how much of the adaptation we get. So when we're prioritizing these low intensity conditioning sessions, for example, zone 1, zone 2, low intensity, steady state cardio, that has been drummed into you through various health influencers and podcasts, we're primarily targeting central adaptations at the heart, so being able to pump more blood per heartbeat. But high intensity training primarily targets peripheral adaptations at the muscle, so being able to use that oxygen better and recover between efforts. Now, these are not isolated adaptations. You will get some central adaptations through high intensity training, you'll get some peripheral adaptations through low intensity training, but you're going to target preferential, central, or peripheral based on the intensity. Now, why is this important? Well, fatigue is likely more peripherally related than centrally, which is something that is very rarely discussed. 2, sharp drops in muscle oxygenation are needed to improve oxygen use and recovery within the muscle. And 3, high intensity training saves a ton of time. And I'm going to touch on that in a bit too. But regardless, we have brand new research that was just published by Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babry, adding to the body of literature on high intensity training. Now, a little while back, I covered Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babry's first paper in boxing regarding conditioning, and you can actually go back and watch this video after that. But this is just an extension of that paper, adding more information to the body of literature, and also building on Dr. John Babry's decade plus of high intensity research that he's performed around this. So I'm gonna break this down so it's easy to understand. That means I won't be covering absolutely everything in the paper. I just wanna cover the most important points for you so you can take practical action. So here's what they did. They had a cohort of professional boxers. For 3 weeks, they performed 3 times a week sprint intervals. This was 3 times 30-second sprints with 60 seconds rest. And this was on a load bike. So essentially, you could just call it a spin bike or a stationary bike, and it had 7.5% body mass as the load. So typically what Dr. Andrew Usher recommends is if you're on a spin bike, that's about 2.5 turns of the resistance dial knob. And that will give you approximately around that resistance. In other ways, it should just feel like that you're having to resist against something while you're doing your sprints. So they did that 3 times a week. So if you're adding up total time, we're talking 4.5 minutes of total time for the session and only 1 minute and 30 for total work. So you can see how short this is. And here is what they found from these 3 weeks of sprint interval training. So significant improvements in time to exhaustion on the incremental treadmill test. So this is a VO2 max test. Essentially, you're running on the treadmill, increasing speed gradually, then increasing incline gradually, and you're just going until voluntary failure. And what they found was, on average, sprint intervals increased time to exhaustion by, on average, 51 seconds. And because they were able to go longer during this test, it infers that central adaptations do occur with supramaximal sprint training. They also found that there were significant improvements in mitochondrial function, which means that mitochondria were able to turn on earlier. So it means they're able to remove metabolic disturbances from essentially creating energy faster, enhancing recovery between efforts. They also found significantly higher muscle oxygen saturation at the end of the test, indicating better oxygen use, again falling in line with mitochondrial function. And regarding fatigue, their data shows that VO2 peak, so essentially reaching their VO2 max, occurs before muscle oxygenation has bottomed out. It means that while aerobic capacity is important, so think about the low intensity steady state runs that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, how much more of that is really needed. Further, it is suggested that time to exhaustion is much more about peripheral change. So again, we're talking about changes within the muscle related to the muscle's ability to slow down metabolic disturbance, which leads to failure of contraction. So essentially this very short stint of sprint intervals was able to improve the fatigue resistance of the muscles, meaning you're not going to gas out as fast, while improving central function as well. So what's amazing is how quickly they occur. 9 sessions over 3 weeks made a drastic improvement. And these are professional boxers. This is not untrained subjects that are going to improve doing anything. These are high-level athletes already. So the question becomes, what does this mean for your conditioning? Under the traditional energy system model, we would typically spend as much time as possible hammering low-intensity training. And that is still the message being pushed, not just in combat sports, but in most areas of sports conditioning. And then potentially the final 4 weeks of your fight camp, you might perform your hard, quote unquote, anaerobic style training to promote that sharp increase in performance and almost turn that aerobic energy base that you've built into a higher power output conditioning session, essentially. And it'll be programmed this way mainly because we typically see aerobic and anaerobic performance cap out relatively quickly when we're doing high intensity training. And further, based on existing endurance training research, we see that elite endurance athletes spend 80+% of their time training in zone 1. Again, that's their sport and they need to build volume to handle the volumes that they're performing in those races. But based on Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babrai's research, we see a slightly different picture and a rejection of the traditional energy system model to conditioning for intermittent and for combat sports. And I go through a lot of these details in the free MMA and free Jiu-Jitsu strength and conditioning blueprints. They are down in the description, first 2 links. They'll also be in the comments as well. So pick that up too. But typically sprint interval training would be classed as quote unquote anaerobic energy system training because of the high intensity and the high blood lactate levels that we get from it. However, improving time to exhaustion and recovery through better oxygen use means it's still a highly aerobic exercise. Remember, anaerobic means without oxygen. But if oxygen is being used within the muscle, the exercise cannot be an anaerobic exercise. It's just that high intensity training preferentially targets peripheral adaptations over central adaptations. And I believe that's how we should look at conditioning instead of looking at aerobic versus anaerobic. It should be looked at as central versus peripheral adaptations. But that's just terminology. Practically, it means that we can likely do far longer stints of high intensity training or sprint interval training than the 3 or 4 weeks that we maybe thought would max out these aerobic and anaerobic tests. For example, if a typical fight camp is 8 weeks, you could start sprint intervals from week 1. It will save you time and not take a lot of energy, even though it is high intensity, since the volume is so low. Remember, we're doing 1:30 of work in that session, and the entire sprint interval session was under 5 minutes. Because that volume is so low, you leave more time and resources, including energy, for technical and tactical training. You can also tack this at the end of a hard technical or tactical training or sparring. That way you're combining it within the session and you're able to save time and get that conditioning hit. And anecdotally, from experience doing these, yes, straight after your sprint intervals, you will feel gassed and you will feel beat up, but within 30 minutes to an hour, you will feel really good, almost primed to be able to do other things. Now, I'm not saying do your sprint intervals before your technical and tactical training, but what I'm saying is you can do these at the end of a session and you're not gonna have that knock-on effect the next day as if you were doing something more intense. Now, that is performing sprint intervals on a bike. If you're doing them running, you're probably gonna incur some kind of fatigue, and I wouldn't recommend doing flat ground sprinting as your sprint intervals because of the increased risk of injury. Outside of fight camp, you can still use some form of high intensity sprint training with more emphasis on centrally targeted sessions like various long and short high intensity interval training, or even a zone 1, zone 2 approach if you have the time and you want to do the volume and that's what you enjoy doing. But there are ways you can perform your conditioning that are going to save you time through short and long high intensity interval training and this kind of sprint interval training. But when prioritizing intensity, for example, in your fight camp and you want to use some of these sprint intervals, you can use these guidelines from Dr. John Babrai, especially if you don't have any of the other equipment. 6 to 30-second long work intervals. So you have a lot to play in there to be able to vary it. 1 to 2 minutes of total work. As you saw in the study, it was 1:30 of total work. So you can go anywhere from 1 to 2 minutes is typically what is recommended by Dr. John Babrai. You're looking at a 1 to 2 to 1 to 8 work to rest. The study used a 1 to 2. Absolutely brutal. I would not recommend starting there because that is killer. You can start further out. For example, a lot of the older high intensity research from Dr. John Babrai used 10 by 6 seconds on with 30 seconds rest. That seems to be, I've found, a good place to start. That's challenging, but not going to absolutely throw you off the edge. So that's what I recommend to start at. And then you can change your intervals throughout the training cycle. You can increase work time, decrease rest time. You can change the various interval times. Maybe you can do one day of shorter intervals, like 6-second intervals, another day maybe with the 30-second intervals. You can play around. The change is what's going to spur further adaptation, so you're not doing these same intervals for the entire, say, 8-week fight camp. Again, in less than 30 minutes a week, you can make huge improvements in your ability to resist fatigue and improve your conditioning for combat sports. And if you like this, comment below. Let me know if there's anything else you want me to cover, and I'll see you in the next video.